many other...
Officials, right? Arab?
Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast. I'm Simon Marks, live in Washington, D.C. And these are the headlines of this Monday. US Vice President Kamala Harris calls the deadly weekend shooting in Buffalo horrendous. She says hate against any individual citizen should be treated as hate against the whole of the nation. India and Nepal agreed jointly to build a hydroelectric power plant in Nepal's eastern region. It's among 6 deals concluded between India and Nepal during Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 5th visit to the Himalayan nation. Shanghai's deputy mayor hints at ending strict COVID-19 lockdowns by June as the Chinese economy slumps. Industrial output and retail sales fell in April at the fastest rate in more than 2 years. American fast food giant McDonald's will exit the Russian market entirely and sell its business in the increasingly isolated country. In March, McDonald's shuttered 850 restaurants across Russia. Mercury soars to record levels in India as South Asia reels under a severe heat wave. The Indian Weather Department says temperatures in the north are likely to abate for the next 4 days. And speaking exclusively at WION's Global Summit, Iran's former president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad says wars help the US and other world powers further their global hegemony. And without war, he says, capitalism will be incapable of continuing. It was a deadly weekend for the United States, with at least 3 major mass shooting incidents, leaving a total of 13 people dead and several injured. One was at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, another at a flea market in Texas, and the third at a church in California. At least 1 person is dead and 5 others wounded after a man opened fire there at the Geneva Presbyterian Church. It's in Laguna Woods, California. Police have a suspect in custody. He's believed to be an Asian man in his 60s who does not live in the area. The suspect was detained at the scene after a group of parishioners at the church, mostly Taiwanese congregants, hogtied his legs and confiscated 2 handguns from him. The motive for that attack is still being investigated. In Buffalo, New York, 10 people were killed in what appears to have been a racially motivated shooting at a supermarket on Saturday. The suspect was wearing tactical gear. He live-streamed his attack. He is in police custody and has been identified as an 18-year-old white male. The US Department of Justice says it's investigating that mass shooting as a hate crime and an act of racially motivated violent extremism. Mourners gathered outside the supermarket to honour the victims, who ranged in age from 32 to 86. Shock spread after a manifesto was discovered, allegedly authored by the teenage white supremacist gunman. The 180-page document claimed that white Americans are in danger of being replaced in society by people of colour. Vice President Kamala Harris labelled the incident horrendous.
That you are with her, never leaving or forsaking her, Father God, but watching over her, oh God.
It's horrendous. It's horrendous. In our country,
we have to recognize that we may very well be experiencing an epidemic of hate towards so many Americans that is wrong. It is taking on a level of violence in the case of what happened in Buffalo, and we've seen it in other places in our country. And we all must speak out against it. Hate against any one of us, we should interpret it as being hate against all of us as a nation. We are a nation.
WION's correspondent Nick Harper joins us now live from Washington, D.C. And Nick, Kamala Harris there, President Biden also over the weekend interrupting his weekend because of another act of mass violence, expressing horror, insisting the country absolutely must unite to overcome hate. But in legislative terms, that doesn't add up to a row of beans, does it?
No, you're right, Simon. From a legislative point of view, it is all but impossible for President Biden, or really any president, to try and tackle this problem. Remember that the freedom of speech is enshrined in the US Constitution. It's there in the First Amendment. Changing that would be virtually impossible. It has been really a theme, I guess, of the whole of President Biden's time in office, this idea of overcoming hate. It's something that he mentioned many times during his inaugural address at the start of last year. Remember that bruising campaign that he waged against the former President Donald Trump. Hatred was very central to that campaign. It was something that President Biden wanted to overcome, but about a year or so into his presidency, he all but acknowledged that it would be virtually impossible to overcome that divisive hatred in the nation, that Republicans and Democrats have very different views, and many of those are deeply entrenched. However, there is a possibility from a legislative point of view of tackling hate speech, and that is something that the governor of New York State, Kathy Hochul, has been speaking about over the weekend. She's a resident of Buffalo. That's where she was originally born and raised, and she has been speaking about that idea of trying to meet with social media companies in the days and weeks to come to try and get them to tackle the problem of hate speech on their platform. She's described it as a spreading like a virus. She said that social media platforms allowed hatred to ferment. She's also talked about the fact that the gunman live streamed his killings and the fact that it went online and that millions of people viewed it. And even though it was removed quite quickly, it popped up on other sites during the course of the weekend. So legislatively very difficult to make massive changes, but the idea is to try and chip away at some of those areas, like how social media platforms can respond to hate speech. That's something that Kathy Hochul is hoping to try and take on.
But, Nick, there were 20 million guns sold in the United States last year alone, and it was notable on social media this weekend that amid the outpouring of grief created by the shootings in Buffalo, in Los Angeles and also in Texas, there were many voices saying, well, this just underscores the need to go and get more weaponry. The country's becoming more dangerous and we need to have, as citizens, the weapons to defend ourselves. I mean, it seems now that each of these incidents almost fuels gun sales to the same degree as they fuel calls for meaningful gun control.
Yeah, absolutely right. The statistics show that after mass shootings, there is a spike in gun sales nearly every single time in the United States. So not just this weekend, but every time we see a mass shooting, there is this cycle, this self-perpetuating cycle of people saying, look, the only way to protect ourselves is to buy more weaponry. President Biden has been very clear that he wants to take on the issue of guns. It's something that he said at the beginning of his presidency he wanted to try and tackle, to put in stricter gun control measures. He's even talked about going as far as holding gun manufacturers accountable. So if a gunman uses a particular weapon, victims' families could then sue that gun manufacturer. Almost impossible to try and put into law, but it's something that he says he wants to do. It is is a very divisive issue in the US. Very broadly speaking, Democrats are for more tighter gun control measures, whereas Republicans say they have the right to bear arms put into the Constitution, the Second Amendment. Trying to make changes will be very difficult. But remember, in the United States, there are more guns than people. The population of the US is about 330 million. There are 390 million firearms across the United States, more than enough for every single man, woman and child. So even though President Biden wants to make those changes, with this cycle of people saying there's been a shooting, we need to buy more weapons, it's very tough to try and put that into any legislative format that then would be able to pass Congress.
Yeah, but as you said, Nick, definitely worth keeping an eye on those efforts possibly to lift immunity for the manufacturers of those weapons. That's WION's Nick Harper joining us this morning live from right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for that, Nick. Moving on now to Germany, a heavy defeat appears to be looming for Chancellor Olaf Scholz in the latest election held in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany's most populous state. Sources report that Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats are about to suffer a crushing defeat. Around 13 million people voted for a new government in the biggest election in Germany this year. Exit polls suggest Olaf Scholz's SPD gained around 28% of the votes, while the Conservative CDU is leading with around 35%. But the biggest gainer may prove to be the Greens. According to projections, the support for the Green Party has nearly tripled from just 6.4% back in 2017 to 18.1% today. Green ministers at the federal level are perceived by many voters to be stronger than the Social Democrats in their response to the war by Russia in Ukraine. In the absence of a majority win, a potential coalition would be formed, and both the SPD and the CDU would try to persuade the Greens to join their efforts to form an administration.
The Greens are strong winners of this election. So, of course, the talks with the Greens are particularly important, and I think it is clear that there is no government mandate for the Social Democrats in North Rhine-Westphalia.
Unser Ergebnis liegt unter unseren Erwartungen. Wir wollten stärkste Partei werden. Das ist uns nicht gelungen. Uns trennt einige Prozentpunkte von der Union tatsächlich. Aber eins steht auch fest am heutigen Abend. Schwarz-Gelb, unser Wahlziel Nummer 1, abzuwählen. Das hat geklappt. Schwarz-Gelb hat keine Mehrheit mehr hier in Nordrhein-Westfalen.
Chancellor Scholz has held the reins of Europe's biggest economy for less than 6 months. The likely loss of North Rhine-Westphalia would be a big blow for him. His ratings have been sliding since the war in Ukraine began. Critics accuse him of hesitancy to provide heavy weapons to help Kiev resist Russia's invasion. Joining me now from Berlin, live, is WION's man in the German capital, Trent Murray. Trent, good to see you there today. What does all of this mean for the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz? It's a pretty early rejection of his leadership, right?
Yeah, it certainly is a setback for Olaf Scholz. It's not where a leader would want their party to be when he's only been in the job, of course, less than 6 months. But also the reason it is so significant is because North Rhine-Westphalia really is a political powerhouse, given it is the biggest state, about 13 million voters are there. And so it's often said if you can win big in North Rhine-Westphalia, then you're well and truly on the way to the Chancellery. But it seems that the SPD, Olaf Scholz's party, is in fact going backwards there. And so I think a lot of minds will have been concentrated in the Chancellery today as these results continue to trickle through. The big winners are the Christian Democrats. Angela Merkel's old party, of course, they're still somewhat licking their wounds from losing the federal election last year. But region by region, they are staging somewhat of a comeback. Of course, they lead the vote, as you say, close to 36%. 4%. They are now in the box seat to form a coalition government up there. But the other big winners really are the Greens. They have come roaring forward in this election. 18.2% of the vote share. Now, that is up 12%. They are at an unprecedented high. And I think that really does come off the back, as you say, of two very high-profile Greens in this country. Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, who is now on the news nightly given the war in Ukraine, and also Robert Habeck, the economy minister, again, the man trying to handle all of the money and the economic fallout caused by the war. So we, of course, now have to see what coalition government will be put together. It is still possible for the SPD to put together a coalition government. It would need the Greens and the much smaller pro-business FDP party. But most analysts here expect it won't go that way. In fact, the Greens will probably pair up with the Christian Democrats. And by doing that, they send a signal here in Berlin that the SPD at a federal level needs to essentially be on its toes, because the Greens are willing to work with the Christian Democrats if this coalition government federally, for some reason, doesn't work out.
And Trent, what message does all of this suggest about the impact of Ukraine on the German electorate and on German politics?
Well, I think it essentially lines up with what the polling has been telling us now for several months, which is a majority of the German population simply doesn't believe Olaf Scholz is leading when it comes to Ukraine, is doing enough, particularly on issues like sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine to help Kyiv push back against the Russians. Also, long-running questions over his party's relationship with Russia. It was Gerhard Schröder, the former SPD chancellor, that was the chairman of Nord Stream 2, continues to have links to Russia. And the SPD were big supporters of that gas policy, which has now got Germany really unstuck given the war in Ukraine, and has found them desperately now trying to talk to Qatar and Norway to find LNG elsewhere, given the threat now that Russia is going to turn off the gas here. So I think it will, as I say, concentrate minds in the Chancellery, really make Olaf Scholz think about whether he's taken the public temperature correctly in all of this, and maybe whether he does need to step up more to help Ukraine, more like the UK and the United States has. He's been hesitant so far, but we may just see a shift given the bloody nose he's got over the weekend from this very important election.
Fascinating stuff. The long coattails of Ukraine. Trent Murray, WION's correspondent in Berlin, thanks very much indeed for that live update. More impacts of Ukraine now. Sweden's ruling party has agreed to join NATO, paving the way for the country to make an application very soon. Parliamentarians convened a special session to discuss the accession. Along with Finland, two Scandinavian countries are now ready to abandon decades of neutrality, and it's all because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Nordic countries Finland and Sweden have been strongly considering applying for NATO membership, and on Sunday, their considerations became more real. Finnish President Sauli Niinistö confirmed that Finland would apply to join NATO, while Sweden's ruling Social Democrats announced an official policy change that could pave the way for Sweden's application in the coming days. If Sweden does not apply, they would be the only Nordic outsider. Other Nordic countries like Norway, Denmark, and Iceland joined the pact as founding members. Finland and Sweden would like guarantees that NATO member nations would defend them while the application process is underway. Finland's president spoke to Russian President Vladimir Putin on Saturday and said their conversation did not contain any threats, despite Moscow repeatedly warning of serious consequences if the nations join NATO. Ratification can take a year as parliaments of all 30 NATO countries need to approve new members. However, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says arrangements for the interim period can be made.
We will try to speed up that process as much as possible. Many allies have stated that they will find fast tracks, as for instance Germany has indicated that this can go quite fast. We will look into ways to provide security assurances, including by increasing NATO presence in the region. in the Baltic region, in and around Finland and Sweden.
While many member nations such as Britain, Germany, and the United States are showing support, Turkey is holding back. Turkey surprised its allies in recent days by saying it had reservations about Finnish and Swedish membership due to their support of Kurdish militant groups present on their territory. On Sunday, in a meeting with foreign ministers in Berlin, Turkey said in order to support their memberships, the Nordic nations must halt Kurdish militant support, as well as lift bans on some sales of arms to Turkey. Sunday's meeting seemed promising as Turkey's foreign minister said talks with Swedish and Finnish counterparts were helpful. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken echoed those remarks.
I don't want to characterize the specific conversation that we had either with the foreign minister or within the NATO sessions themselves, but I can say this much. I heard almost across the board very strong support for Finland and NATO joining the alliance if that's what they choose to do, and I'm very confident that we will reach consensus on that.
Once vetted by NATO allies, and if Turkish objections are met, approval could come in a matter of weeks.
Israel's top court has rejected petitions against the construction of a cable car project in East Jerusalem. It says a proper plan has been followed and the project requires no intervention. Opponents of the plan have repeatedly argued that the project would alter the ancient landscape and damage Palestinian settlements in the region. This is the second time an Israeli court has ruled in favour of the state following the landmark Masafa Yatta ruling weeks ago.
Israeli and Palestinian opponents of a plan to run a cable car over Jerusalem lost their Supreme Court battle on Sunday. A unanimous ruling from a 3-judge panel showed the court had decided against intervening to reverse the Israeli government's 2019 approval of the project, which critics say will fundamentally alter the city's ancient landscape. The court said proper planning procedures had been followed. The proposed cable car would shuttle some 3,000 tourists and worshippers per hour from the western part of Jerusalem to an area near the dung entrance to the eastern Old City. Palestinians say the project will erase heritage in areas they seek for a future state. They also complain cable cars will be running just above their homes. Israeli cultural and environmental groups and Palestinians in the East Jerusalem neighborhood Silwan were among petitioners against the project. Tweeting after the decision, Haggett Ofran of Israel's Peace Now group said, "What's left now is the public struggle to stop this insane project." The Israeli government says the cable car would be a boon for tourism to sites in the Old City that are holy to Jews, Muslims and Christians, and would alleviate heavy traffic to the area.
And finally from us today, a dramatic total lunar eclipse took place last night, coinciding with a supermoon. And people around the world rushed outside with their telescopes and other equipment to catch a glimpse. We're going to leave you with a spectacular time-lapse of the super flower blood moon captured in Greece. I'll be back again tomorrow, same time, with another edition of WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching and stay with WION. World is one.
This is right, Arab.